Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Great. Hey, everybody.
Well, we have something exciting for you today. We have an interview with Carson Gross, the inventor of HTMX and the author of Hypermedia Systems, a book we reviewed, did 2 episodes on. Fantastic book, fantastic guy. Really, really great discussion. Nathan, give our listeners just a bit of a preview of what they're going to hear in this interview.
Yeah, Carson he's just got this really nice, approachable sense of humor, and I think he's got a lot of self-awareness on the strengths and weaknesses of HTMX, and it just shows in the interview, right? It's in the book, it's in his podcast. I mean, it's in his blog. It's just kind of cool. I think it's one of the things that makes HTMX and its community so nice is that they've got leadership like Carson there, and it was just a great conversation. I came out of it really kind of inspired to go build some stuff.
Absolutely. We have no shortage of impressive people coming on this podcast, sharing their wisdom. Carson absolutely stands with the best of them. Stay tuned for the whole thing. And in particular, if you're a fan of Book Overflow, stay tuned for some discussion of a recent essay published by John Ousterhout and Bob Martin, where they discuss their different coding philosophies. And there's some fun tidbits in there about how the Book Overflow podcast was involved in making that happen. But stick around for the whole thing because Carson Gross is just absolutely fascinating and fantastic guy. Couldn't be happier to have him on. So this is Carson Gross as he reflects on his book, Hypermedia Systems. Well, thanks for being here, Carson. It's nice to have you.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, not a problem. We always like to ask all of our authors, just before we get started with all of the questions we have about the book, why did you choose to write this book? Why did you write Hypermedia Systems? And maybe we like to ask authors if the book is a little older to describe the CS landscape at the time.
Sure.
I know this is a little more recent, but if you want, you can tell us what it was about the CS landscape that prompted you to write this book and also to develop the framework.
Yeah. Well, so again, thank you for having me on. My name is Carson Gross, and I created HTMX and wrote the book Hypermedia Systems that you guys reviewed. And I wrote the book because I was actually everyone wants to write a book, right? You're a computer programmer, you want to write a book. And I had always hoped, like for me, I don't know, it's not as a cool thing now, but like O'Reilly was always like, oh man, someday if I write an O'Reilly book, I've made it. So I was contacted. HTMX was starting to get popular. This was before the Primogen picked it up, which is really Primogen and Fireship Dev are what made HTMX a thing.
Very cool.
And so this was probably about 2 years actually before that, so pretty early on. And I actually just got contacted by Manning publishers, and Manning makes really good books, and they were like, hey, we kind of like what you're doing with HTMX. Would you be interested in writing a book about it? And I was like, oh, that's cool. Manning to me is like, a great publisher, and they've got their cool covers and all that. So I was like, okay, I think what I'll do is I'll write a book on hypermedia, and, it'll be HTMX, but I'll try and work some theory in there too. And so I worked on that, and I had recruited the guy who works on another technology called Hyperview, which is the third part of the Hypermedia Systems book, Adam Stepinski, to come in and help. He was going to write some chapters too, because I kind of wanted it to be more about hypermedia, not just about HTMX. And pretty much we had an editor, and we went back and forth and did like the whole real, once a week checking in with your editor thing for, I think about 9 months. And then I got a random call. I wasn't expecting it, but I got a random call. And the guy who was in charge of the project's like, hey, I'm sorry, but we're just we're not going to go forward with this. We don't think.
Oh, what?
He didn't really say why, but my sense was it just wasn't a big enough market, and I'm sure they've got a finger on the pulse. So that was a pretty big gut blow at the time, because I went from thinking like, oh, cool, I'm gonna have my name on a book and all the rest of it. If your listeners, I'm sure everyone knows this, but writing a book is not a way to make money. It's right, like at least not the book itself.
That's what we've heard from several of the authors.
Yeah. So it's good, good marketing and all the rest of it. But and I just wanted.
If it's any consolation, this podcast is not a way to make money either.
Yeah, no, none of this is. It's all just us being silly. But so that was a pretty big gut punch, and so I kind of was like, whoa, okay. And then I took a step back, and every bad thing that happens is also a good thing if you look at it from the right place. And I was like, okay, well, one thing I didn't like 100% about the book that I was writing for Manning was that it was written in sort of the Manning structure. Like they want a specific, like, okay, it needs to look like this, and they do that because that's what sells, and that's what obviously that's their primary concern as a publisher. Well, I understood that. I also wanted, just personally, I wanted to write a book that was had more theory in it, or more background, sort of less just like, here's how to do things in this tool. And so it gave us an opportunity to, and I, talked with the other authors and was like, hey guys, the rights reverted to us, so we own all this stuff. So why don't we just publish it ourselves? So I went down that sort of path and figured out how Amazon self-publishing works and all that stuff. Got lucky that the guy at Berkeley Graphics, which is now US Graphics, offered to do the cover for us.
Very cool.
And so all that kind of came together, and we were like, okay, we're going to release it in July, I think, of 2023 it was. Just like, again, showing how much more important it is to be lucky than good. Right at that time, right when we were releasing the book, Primeagen and Fireship Dev both covered HTMX. And so we were able to release it into, a pretty favorable market. And so that's kind of how it came to be. It's structured a little bit different than most programming books, in that it sort of like it's in thirds. And so the first third is more theoretical and backgroundy, and then like the middle part is here's how to use HTMX, and then the last part is here's Hyperview, which is a mobile hypermedia. So that's how it happened. That's how a book came out.
Well, we really appreciated, just by nature of the podcast, because, it's an audio medium, we try to stick with books that are kind of more theory, just the things we can talk about. Sometimes you're just reading something that's just code example after code example. It doesn't make for a very engaging discussion. So we really appreciated that about this book, and found the first third very, very interesting. And, it challenges a lot of assumptions, right? I think there are, it's funny. We had this conversation when we interviewed Brian Kernahan about Unix, a history and a memoir, which is basically, was Unix inevitable? At some point, was someone going to invent something very much like Unix, and because it's kind of the optimal form for an operating system, would take the world by storm? Or is it just happenstance that happened to be the right operating system, or the operating system that was made at the time, and it was good enough, and now everything's built off Unix, there's no going back? And I think the world we live in, which is not JSON APIs, is how everything's done, and you can kind of think, well, maybe that's the way we do it, is because it's just optimal that way. And so it was really cool to read a book that challenged that assumption entirely and said, what if the whole way we're exchanging data across the internet is wrong?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far. I try to be balanced about these
but
things.
You do list a lot of cases where HTMX might not work. I
think there's something to that. I don't know. It's hard on the internet because, especially today, maybe it's always been like this, but people want hard answers. Like, is X better than Y? And it's like, well, depends. And nobody likes that answer, but it's true. But at the same time, there's strengths and weaknesses to different approaches. And so I try, in the book and also on the essays page on htmx.org to sort of lay out, like, here are the strengths of hypermedia. Here are the weaknesses of hypermedia, and here's when it's probably a good fit, and here's when it's probably not a good fit. I do think, Unix at some level, like, kind of had to happen. Maybe, I don't know. It's sort of it's one way of doing things. Have you ever read the Worse is Better paper?
Are we just talking about this, Nathan?
We literally were just talking about it. Yeah, I've read it, and
I haven't read it.
It's like a fundamental building block of the internet.
Worse is Better is an interesting. It was written by a Lisp guy who was trying to understand how come Lisp, which was so much better than C, like how come Lisp lost to C, because Lisp was garbage collected and it was symbolic and a much higher level programming language than C, but somehow C won. There are just these. It's funny that sometimes the better technology doesn't always win because of various things. Like when I look at JSON today, the way that it's used, and I would say I think it's overused in general for many cases. The reason why people use JSON now, there's like knock-on effects. Like, okay, React, everyone knows React, and ShadCN is written in React because everybody knows React, and now everyone uses React because ShadCN is written in React, right? And there's like this sort of feedback loop that just builds on stuff. But when you go back and look at why did people switch to JSON at the time, it was because of the shortcomings of the hypermedia implementation of the web at that time. And so there's an accident to it, but then there's also an essence to it, which is JSON APIs are sort of a pure data API that's also human friendly. Like it's about the purest data API that's also humans can look at it and get their heads around it. Like you're not going to go look at like a protobuf API and like what's on the wire and understand what's going on. And so there's this essential aspect of JSON. And so that, like all these things kind of come together in a pot of like accident and essence and history that like make a thing happen at a certain time. And I think that's also true of HTMX, like HTMX getting popular. It had to because intercooler. So HTMX, the history of it is I released it in, I think 2018, or maybe 2020. I can't remember. I'm old. But it was right when COVID, like the COVID lockdowns were why HTMX exists. And again, that's an accident of history. Like just happened to be, I was stuck inside. But before that, there was another library that's very similar called Intercooler.js. And I had released that back in like 2013. And so it had been around for a while and people were using it and so forth. And, but I think we had to go through the experience of everything being sort of JSON maximalism and SPA maximalism for people to start to see some of the weaknesses and like, man, this seems like a lot of work for what I'm doing, in order for people to be prepared for something like HTMX. And so if you look at the difference in reception between Intercooler.js and HTMX, I think it shows that they're not fundamentally technologically that different from one another. But we just had to get to the spot we're at now in order to appreciate, there were some advantages to that older way of doing things.
Most of us spent COVID either making sourdough or having our brain melted by Twitter. So right. I'm impressed that you used your time to create HTMX.
I knew my brain was going to melt. So I was like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm going to lock myself in a room and I'm going to rewrite intercooler without the jQuery dependency. That's basically what HTMX is.
My knee-jerk reaction was going to grad school. So writing HTMX sounds like more fun. So that's okay. One of the so back to the Unix Unix history book. One of the characters that came out of that was really interesting was Doug McElroy. I had not really thought much about his career, but he's the whole reason that pipes exist and standard in, standard out, standard error kind of is existing in the way it does. Roy Fielding ended up becoming a reoccurring character, a very important one. The history of hypermedia, and it's very quotable. I mean, like hilarious quotes. I'm just like rolling on the floor as we go through it. Before we get into that, I have a question. So REST, super easy to pronounce. How
Yeah.
do I pronounce? Is it HATEOAS? How do I pronounce?
HATEOAS.
HATEOAS.
It's the way
Adios.
HATEOS.
I was like,
HATEOS.
okay.
It sounds like it's a bad name, particularly for today. It sounds like a breakfast cereal for people that should be canceled or something like that. But
Adios.
That's hilarious.
but I've always pronounced it HATEOS. I've never heard Fielding pronounce it. I don't think he didn't coin that. There's the acronym HATEOS is not in his dissertation.
Okay.
The term hypermedia or hypertext, it might be hypertext, but hyper whatever as the engine of application state is definitely in there. But I think other people shorten that into HATEOS, which is the way I would say.
Okay,
it.
good. Thank you. I was like, well, we're gonna have Carson on, so I can
Yeah.
find out because
I'm not the arbiter of this, though. I'm sure I pronounce words wrong all the time.
yeah,
so.
me too. I think I had mispronounced idempotent for years, and it was like embarrassing. I was like idempotent, or yeah. So
No, a funny story. I went to school, so I read a lot when I was a kid, but my school was okay school, but a little rural. And I went to college, and I was talking with a girl, and I said indict instead of indict because I just read it for my entire life. And she mocked me mercilessly for that for the remainder of our very short acquaintance.
I still have a friend who she pronounced chaos as chose. And like, you shouldn't make fun of people because like she'd only ever read it and she read a lot, but it was just too funny. And we still make fun of her.
Now, if she
so
said
Phoenix,
chaos,
if you're listening,
I would have been impressed because that sounds fancy. So what's the most surprising outcome that you've had of putting HTMX and the focus on hypermedia systems in general out there? Like
Well, I'm surprised it worked, because it didn't work. As I gave a talk at Big Sky DevCon last year. Like, how come everyone's like, oh, he's such a marketing genius, but I've been doing the same thing for a decade now. I really think it's a mix of timing and, the random, just the things have to be in a certain spot, like there were social networks before Facebook, but Facebook was right place, right time. And similarly, there were search engines before Google. There were pretty good ones before Google, but Google had a little bit better angle on things. So I don't understand why things have gone as well as they've gone this time around, except that, we have experience now with the SPA approach, which is not a bad approach. Again, I don't want to come across as saying that's a bad approach. It's actually in some ways an older approach because it's much more like the thick client applications that we wrote in like the 1980s, where you're using a data API, or if you want more like mobile development, where mobile development has, there's a thick client that's working with a fixed API. And so I think there just a lot of things had to come together to make hypermedia sort of like resurge. I obviously, if you see my Twitter account, I act pretty outrageous on it. And that's in part because that's just my personality. Like part of my personality anyways is to be pretty outrageous, but also, it's worked for me to get people talking about HTMX and the ideas of hypermedia. So boy, I wish I had a good solid answer, but I don't, because it seems like just a lot of things have to come. I do think like one thing I said in that talk last year that I think is, if there's a lot of dumb luck in life, which it appears there is, then one of the important things is to stick around and wait for dumb luck to sort of like come along.
Oh, interesting. And
so I think it's really important to stay positive in general about things and not focus on negatives. Like I try hard. It's obviously, we're all prone to being negative online, but I try pretty hard to be positive online because if you're not having fun, you're going to give up. And so, but if you're having fun along the way, which is one reason why my Twitter account is pretty, silly, is because it keeps me like, oh, this will be fun. Like if nothing else, at least it'll be fun. And then that lets you, that's an actionable thing you can do where if people are like, oh, it's all just dumb luck. It is dumb luck at some level, but like something's going to happen. But that means you just need to hang around. And the way to hang around, again, in my experience, is just to be like, I'm not a naturally positive person. I can be pretty sarcastic and so forth. And I've just found over time, you just stay positive and be silly about it and kind of accept that like things like everything's going to be pretty nonlinear, and you'll end up in a better spot and in a position to take advantage when like someone like Prime's like, oh, this is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that's how I really captured my attention was when you went on or when Prime started talking about it.
Right.
It was before that. I actually have a friend who's like an early adopter of like anything. And I remember he sent me a link to HTMX, and I was like, I don't understand the big deal. And it took me a little while to like. I think I'd also read a book called Rest in Practice, which was like really sold me on thinking about hypermedia in a different way. Of course, it was still a lot of data API endpoint type stuff, but last little follow up here. You recently came out with Fixi, which I thought was really cool. I mean, just like number one, the style of how you announced it. How short the code is, which was like I was amazed, like what 82 lines of code or something. Could you talk to our audience a little bit about Fixi and like what your experiment that is?
So there's a historical, because HTMX it's in a historical lineage, right? Like there was intercooler and then there was HTMX, and HTMX, when we initially built it, I was almost as a joke, I was like, it's going to be IE compatible. Like we're going to make it IE compatible because like, why not? So that meant that there were a lot of features in modern JavaScript that I couldn't take advantage of. I had to do sort of things the old school way, which it doesn't bother me, and it works, it's fine. But there was always this like, okay, well, for example, we use the XHR object for doing Ajax rather than the fetch API. There's actually, it's interesting, there's actually features of XHR that aren't available in fetch, believe it or not, and vice versa. So it's not like fetch is like an exact replacement for XHR. But in any event, HTMX, when I was building it, I had this idea of general hypermedia controls, which I've written an academic paper on that concept now. You can find it on the ACM website. It's called Hypermedia Controls, Feral to Formal. And I go through and talk about like hypermedia controls, sort of nerdy stuff, but whatever. But HTMX, like it was written very much from I'm a web developer and I want to have a tool that gives me all the stuff that I need to build web apps, like indicators and like, request indicators and like history support and just all this stuff. And because of that, it's bigger than it would need to be if it were just purely focused on that idea of hypermedia controls. And that idea has really like crystallized in my head over the last decade as I've been working on intercooler and then HTMX. And so I thought to myself, well, what if I just did a library that only did general hypermedia controls? This is like idea that like any element can issue an HTTP request and the response can be placed anywhere in the DOM. And what if I like took advantage of the modern features? Like this wouldn't be backwards compatible or anything like that. It would be very similar in like at a high level to HTMX and intercooler, which they're all very similar. They're using attributes to drive Ajax interactions, hypermedia based Ajax interactions. And so I just sat down one day and was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to write the minimal thing. And then I was like, okay, if I'm going to do it minimally, I want to do it without any dependencies. Like I'm going to write my own test framework and I'm going to do it with the minimal number of files possible. So I'm going to have an HTML file that's the test file. I'm going to have the JavaScript file and I'm going to have a README, and that's it. Like that's all I'm allowed to have. And really focus on, because the HTMX is focused on practical, day-to-day web development, and then getting all these stupid corner cases right that like make developers' lives easier. Whereas with Fixi, it's like, this is the code and that's it. And if you want something different, then you either fork the code or there's events that you can hook into that can change behaviors, but you're going to be scripting. So it was an opportunity to say, no to a lot of things that I had said yes to in HTMX, and that makes it it's a different library, and it's harder to use at some level, because if you use it, you're going to be using JavaScript more to work with it. But at the same time, it's more essential. It's more close to the essence of the ideas of HTMX, and so I figured someone was going to do it anyways, so it might as well be me. I was in a good position. So it was a fun little project. It's available. If people don't like the HTMX, like what is HTMX, I think it's like 12K compressed. 12K. Gosh, that sounds so big. It's not small. it's not small. Fixi is 3K uncompressed and unminified.
Wow.
And when it's compressed, so it doesn't do, it's not served up via NPM. You actually just, there's a script in the README to like download it and vendor it. You can, if you use Brotli compression, it's basically 1K.
Well, I'm experimenting with Fixi right now because I have a project that I built with zero JavaScript.
Okay.
Because I was a masochist.
Sure.
And so this is me actually being like, okay, I'll try a little bit of JavaScript.
Right. Yeah. Well, if you're using Fixi, don't be afraid to write JavaScript. I mean, JavaScript, this is one thing that I get into. I gave a talk at JS Nation this past November about how HTMX is pro JavaScript, because I think because HTMX is so different than other front-end libraries that people are used to, and because it's focused on annotating HTML with attributes that sort of drive these interactions, people get the impression that it's anti-JavaScript. And so it's definitely true that if you don't like JavaScript, you will like HTMX. But this is like the classic mistake. That doesn't mean if you like HTMX, you don't like JavaScript. HTMX, you're certainly allowed to use JavaScript if you're working in an app based on HTMX or Fixi or whatever. But it's just a different style. It's a different style of scripting. The scripting becomes less, what do I want to say? It's less the focus, and the scripting is mainly focused on what scripting was originally intended for on the web, which is sort of DOM manipulation, features that aren't implemented. The way Fielding actually talked about scripting in his thesis. It's in the code on demand part of REST, it's part of REST is to have scripting. And what he says about it is that scripting is allowed. He calls it an optional constraint for some reason, but he says it's allowed. And because what that means is that your clients in a network system don't have to implement everything up front. Instead, they can download new behaviors. So here, when he says clients, what he's talking about are browsers, they're a hypermedia client. If you think of the web as a hypermedia system. And so one place you can see that is on the HTMX demos. There's an example with drag and drop, and it uses, I think Sortable.js is the library. And what Sortable.js lets you do is grab an element and drag and drop it to another spot, and it animates it and does a nice job of all that. And that's functionality that is not baked into the browser, at least not as nicely as Sortable.js does it. But because the web and REST has this code on demand idea, this notion of scripting, you can download that behavior after the fact and sort of take advantage of it. And so HTMX is not anti-JavaScript. In fact, I think it's pro-JavaScript in some sense, in that it allows JavaScript to be focused on what it was originally designed for and what its strong suit is, which is being there in the browser is like the default extension mechanism. And then, sort of DOM manipulation. You can get crazy with it. I think you guys pointed out, like if you get deep into HTMX and you start doing a lot of scripting, and especially a lot of event-driven programming, it can get crazy, or at least if you're not used to it, it looks like this seems like a lot of work. But it's just a different style of scripting is what I would say.
You say it's not anti-JavaScript, but at the same time, an argument that comes up in the book a couple times is progressive enhancement. And
Sure.
Just being honest, this is one of the arguments that didn't hold as much weight for me. To me, it kind of felt like trying to argue for a new music storage medium that's backwards compatible with the cassette. I was just kind of like, how many people are not running JavaScript in their browser?
Right. Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah. Well, progressive enhancement, for your listeners, if they don't know, what that means is that a website will work with scripting on and it'll do like stuff. But then if you turn JavaScript off, it'll also continue to work using maybe the old sort of way that the web worked. And with HTMX, I have to say, like you, I'm not as convinced by the progressive. Maybe that came across in the writing. And of the three authors, I think I'm probably the least convinced of the utility of progressive enhancement. But HTMX, you can use it in a way so that if JavaScript is turned off, the functionality that you're trying to achieve continues to work. And that's progressive enhancement. And there are a few features. If that is important to you, you kind of have to pick the features of HTMX that you're going to use. I'm not going to try and talk you into thinking that progressive enhancement is super important, because I am like, I think there are times when it's important. Like for government websites, it's probably important that you work without JavaScript being enabled. For internal websites, it's probably not important. For public websites, maybe it's somewhere in between. And so I think that's on a case-by-case basis, but I'm not going to try and convince you of it. And I would go further and say, if you want progressive enhancement, I don't even think HTMX is the best option. There's another library called Unpoly, which, as far as I know, they haven't written a book about it, unfortunately for you guys. But Unpoly has a real sharp focus on progressive enhancement. Like that's their whole thing, is like, we're gonna work in a progressively enhanced way. And they're out of Germany, and so I think if your listeners if they want to try the hypermedia based approach, but they really want like progressive enhancement, then I would point them to Unpoly as probably the library to use rather than HTMX. You can do progressive enhancement with HTMX, but it's not, you still have to do work, whereas Unpoly is really focused on that. So
now that we're speaking about this, progressive enhancements and all these other things, there's a blog post early this year, or was it maybe the tail end of last year, talking about the future of HTMX? Was it the beginning of this year? I guess it was the beginning of this year.
Yeah, either or. It's all blur to me.
Okay. One of them was talking, it was talking about something that I thought was really exciting, which was these proposals to update the web standards to maybe take some of the ideas from HTMX and put it into, generalizing these calls and the tags. And could you speak on this a bit? Because it sounds...
Yeah, that project is called Triptych, and it's a proposal by Alex Petros, who's one of the core developers on HTMX. It's something he's the main author of that and sort of pushing it. And I started talking with the browser people. I got, again, stupid luck. I went out to San Francisco to give a talk, and just happened to, at the time, one of the browser guys on Chrome had noticed HTMX and had emailed me, and I was like, "Hey, I'll come out and give a talk." And so so I talked with some people that were in the browser group there, and made these contacts. And the idea with Triptych is, it's interesting because it's really, so HTMX and even more so Fixi are like, they're based on this sort of academic purist idea of like, what's a hypermedia control, and let's generalize it. And that's great, and it has uses and all the rest of it. But realistically, HTML is a massive specification. And so you might want to see like, oh, we want to see HTMX and HTML. You'll hear HTMX fanboys say that sometimes. But the reality is that that's a long, hard road. And so what Triptych is Alex's take on, okay, what's the most likely to actually make it into the HTML spec? So what's the minimum proposal that gives us the maximum benefit that is realistic for moving into the HTML specification from the ideas of HTMX? And so it's 3 proposals. Let's see, I don't know if I'm gonna remember them all on top of my head, but one is like allow buttons to issue their own the first one is allow forms to issue requests beyond just get and post. So you guys probably know that there's also delete and patch and put. There's all this stuff in HTTP, which is the hypertext transfer protocol, which is not usable from the hypertext from HTML, which is kind of silly. And so that's the first proposal. And then the second proposal is to allow buttons to be their own, to be a standalone hypermedia control, basically to allow a button to issue its own request without needing a form to do so. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And then the last one, and this would be the hardest one probably to get through, would be allowing forms and buttons and links to specify targets in the UI to replace. Like I want to replace that element, which is part of the sort of special sauce of HTMX. And there's actually infrastructure in the web already for something like that. There is a target attribute which exists on anchors and forms, but you can only target iframes. And so you target iframes by ID, and you guys probably know iframes aren't the best experience. And so the ideas are there. The academic, for a listener who's interested in the academic side of things, like the term for this is what's called transclusion. So rather than replacing a document, including a document in another document. And so the ideas are there in very sort of hamstrung form. And so these three proposals are our best guess at what realistic changes can we make to HTML to move some of these ideas into the spec itself.
You talk about setbacks and developing all of this. I think a lot about I'm a big Conan O'Brien fan. And I think if you don't know like late night history, which like why on earth would you? But you think of Conan, he's just the guy who's been around for 30 years and he's generational talent and all that. The story about how Conan got late night is like insane. Like he was a writer on The Simpsons, plucked out of the ether. And then it was real touch and go for the first 2 years. Like there was a chance he was going to get canceled. I love one of the stories he tells. Like I guess he was seeing a therapist at the time, and he was saying like, everyone hates me. They just want me to go away. No one likes me. And therapist was like, well, those are just your feelings. And he said, no, it's the cover of USA Today. And so but I think when all of that's said and done, we kind of say, well, of course, Conan was destined to be successful. Look where he's at. But I think we forget that's not always the case. And so you talk about setbacks and. I was wondering if you could talk to us. You mentioned obviously the Manning not publishing the book was a big setback. What other setbacks have you had developing HTMX, and just how'd you deal with them and your general philosophy of dealing with setbacks?
Yeah, well, so Intercooler, again, I released it back in 2013 and it got popular. I mean, there were, it had a couple thousand stars, which is in my mind is a pretty big deal. But it just never went anywhere. It just kind of there. If you look at again, I point people back to that talk, which I think is called A Theory of Open Source Marketing. Carson Gross and A Theory of, should probably bring it up on YouTube. But if you look at the star curve, which is basically for an open source developer, like that to me is like the signal if I'm doing something good or not. It sort of had a spike early on, but then it sort of flatlined. Just as today, I mean, it's sort of been the same thing for a long time. People look at HTMX or Intercooler back in the day and they just say, this is like stupid, And I think it is stupid if you try to come into it if you try to make HTMX or Intercooler before it do exactly the same thing that an SPA does, it is going to be stupid because that's just not what Hypermedia is designed for. So, there's a couple of pretty funny, like they're funny now, but at the time people were pretty mean about Intercooler on the web. And I got, I took a lot of grief for it at times. Part of that talk that I gave is about how I used to react pretty poorly to it. I used to just get upset and I'd argue with the person, which is typically not a good idea online. What I found, just again, having, you talk about challenges, having Intercooler effectively fail and die prepared me for HTMX to not succeed for the first couple of years, because it was like, dude, it's dead anyways. Like, just have fun. I've also, I'm older. I'm almost 50 years old now. And so like you get to this point in life and it's hard. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. And part of it is just time. But so now when I get negative, like I love negative comments about HTMX, because I can take them and I can put them on Twitter and say something funny and often agree with the person. Like there's like, we've got the HTMX sucks mug, and like the HTMX sucks essay. And like it does suck. Like everything sucks. Like at some level, if you look at it from a certain perspective, it does suck. So what I've learned to do, particularly with HTMX, and particularly I'd say in the last 5 years, is take those negatives and turn them into positives. And again, that's easy to say, and like in the moment, it's not always easy. Like there are times when people say stuff and I'm like, oh man, that pisses me off, and I just want to wall text like that's not true, like blah blah, and I just learned to just say, okay, pump the brakes, come back to it in a day, and like say something funny about it instead, and like maybe find something in there you can agree with. And it really knocks down the negativity a whole bunch for me internally. And then again, I found that it's very useful online. Like some of my best tweets have been screenshotting someone saying just something horrible about HTMX and then posting it to Twitter and like either agreeing with them in a funny way or just being like, man, people are mean. So, I don't know. The setbacks that I've experienced in HTMX and just in my life in general are so minor compared to what, like I have loved ones that have gone through very serious things. So it's hard to say like, oh, there's some magic here, because a lot of this is just me learning to like take things at the level of seriousness that they deserve. But I do think what I've learned over time is the more positive you can respond to the negative things and find something you can agree with in it, is the better off you'll be. So
it's tough because I think we all want to feel like we're doing something important with our lives, but then I think too many people fall into the trap of like, well, it's not important unless I'm really emotionally invested in it. And if I'm really emotionally invested in it, then I've got to have these extreme reactions. And just you saying like it in context, like,
and also just like there's no right answer in technical decisions. There's often not a right answer, right? Like it's just, you can do it that way or you can do it this way. Like, what do you like this way? Then do it this way. Do you like that way? Then do it that way. Like, I'm not gonna, I've had people come in and say like, oh, should I rewrite my application, my React application in HTMX? I'm like, well, is it working? If it's working, why would you don't rewrite it just to rewrite it. If there's an opportunity, if it's not working, if there's too much code, or if the guy who initially did it left and like you can't figure out the code base or something like that, maybe there's an opportunity there. But don't do it just to do it. Like it's just another tool in the tool chest that you can use when, maybe when it's appropriate in a certain, for a certain problem. But it's not, it's not a silver. Certainly, HTMX is not a silver bullet. There have been good experiences with it, I'm happy to talk about those. But there isn't a silver bullet for software. There's a good essay. There's another good essay you should probably read called "No Silver Bullet," which was written by the guy. He was the program manager for the IBM OS 360. And he talks about how, like, basically in software development, there's been one silver bullet we've ever found. And in my opinion, that's garbage collection. Like high-level programming languages, which are effectively just garbage collected programming languages, really make people much more productive, the average developer much more productive. And that's about the only technology that we've ever found that's like, that sort of I think it was 5x is what they estimated.
Interesting.
How much it improves development. But we like object-oriented programming and formal proofs and static type checking and all this stuff hasn't, and even testing, which I'm a big fan of, hasn't really 10x'd productivity in the same way that high-level languages did.
That's interesting. It's not exactly the same, but we had a conversation with Martin Fowler about the term best practices. And is there anything it's truly a best practice? And he framed it as sensible defaults instead.
Right.
But we were trying to figure out, is there anything you should always do in a software project? And the only thing we could come up with was Git. or any sort of version control.
Yeah,
right?
some sort of version control.
Any sort of version control, right? That you really shouldn't start a project without having some sort of version control set up. But
yeah, I'd agree with that. That's actually interesting to think about, because there's certainly times when garbage collection isn't appropriate. So yeah, I don't know. Like I've been kind of having not that they would ever notice me, but like I disagree with clean code. I don't know if you guys have talked to the clean code people, but they recommend like short methods, like, and there was actually, they just posted the guy who wrote A Philosophy of Software Design. I'm blanking on his name.
So
that's our doing.
We actually were the catalyst for this. We were trying to get a debate between Uncle Bob and John Ousterhout.
Yeah, John Ousterhout. Thank you.
Yeah, and then
they had never met until we emailed them.
Okay, perfect.
So
I think that the essay is really good. It's funny too, because neither of them, they're old guys and they won't give up. They're just like they've got their teeth in one another and they are not letting go. It's pretty funny.
We interviewed both of them, Uncle Bob and John Ousterhout.
And I appreciate where Uncle Bob's coming from, but I'm in the John Ousterhout camp as well.
Yeah.
And maybe some of it is also, there's like, I don't know, there's like a craftsmanship to it where he's like, hey, look, like there's these tools that you have and you should really think deeply about this, and other people are using it in a special way. And I think it's a different type of programming maybe than someone who's maybe cranking stuff out on a budget as a contractor or something.
I don't know if I'd even agree with that. I wrote an essay, again, it's on the HTMX.org website, called Code and Dirty, which is about like not coding clean. And I make arguments for not doing things. I sent it to Ousterhout and he wrote back and was like, I agree with some of this, but some of it is wrong. I was like, perfect. So I think there's some indication that like 3 computer programmers, 3 different ideas of what the right way to write code is maybe, and not all, like Ousterhout's obviously very smart. I don't think Uncle Bob is like dumb or whatever. Like, and
sure.
I'm not an idiot. Like, we just have our different takes on how to program. And I think that's okay. I do think it's important, if you go into a code base, to like figure out what the vibe is and match that vibe. So one thing I've seen over time, and one thing I try to do over time, is like match the vibe of the code base. If the code base is clean, then I'm writing clean code. If the vibe is like object oriented, then I'm not going to try and impose functional programming on top of it or whatever. So I think vibe matching is important. Because when things rhyme, a code base should rhyme. Like, it should be okay. This is just sort of the way things work here.
That's cool.
I've mentioned it on the podcast, but I made that mistake joining my current company. I was at a big cloud provider my last company, and one thing you'll learn working there is just like they're really, really good at like operations and incident response, right? Monitoring. They got the whole 9 yards there, and you learn how to kind of run a system that's used by like 1 billion people with like 99.999% uptime. And I kind of, for some reason, fell into the trap thinking like, this is true engineering. This is what everything should be. And so I got to my new company and we're not operating on that scale at all. But I'm trying to like force it into that pattern. And it took me too long to realize, like, wait a minute, like, we don't need all of this. And by trying to do all of this, we're moving slower, and slow is fine when you have a product that's already generating $1 billion a year in revenue. But when you're still even trying to prove the concept, you got to go faster.
Yeah, there's a life cycle to software and to companies and to people, like, it's true. Like, you just, I think you got to match you have to figure out where you are. If you go to work for a company like Google at this point, that's a different thing than going and working for a startup. And a lot of that stuff grows up organically. It's good to have that experience because now you've got it. And as those needs come along, you can be like, okay, now we can do that stuff. But if you try and force it, I think you do end up often causing more damage than good. Obviously the intentions are good. It's just that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot, is the life cycles. And that's one thing that the HTML, like the future of HTMX, where we basically say, look, this concept and API is pretty baked. Like, we're not going to change things too much with it, is a recognition of that fact that like the APIs that HTMX has are they are what they are, and they do what they do. And I don't want to be churning HTMX just to keep it in the headlines. Oh, a new version of HTMX got released or whatever. So that I think recognizing that software has this sort of life cycle, and that's okay. And it takes different skills at different parts, in different parts of that timeline. Like early on, you have to be very open-minded and flexible, and sort of be able to react to things, maybe change APIs around to because you're still exploring the space. And then over time, that changes where you become more conservative in what you take, not just because you're mean or whatever and don't want to listen to it, but because you have people that are relying on the existing code, and hopefully you got the abstractions right. And so just commit to those. If you want to do something new, maybe that's a new product, which is kind of like what Fixi is, right? Like I've always looked at the HTMX code base and been like, man, this is a lot of code. What's up with that? So rather than just like tearing everything out and being like, okay, HTMX3, like now you don't get any of that crap. I don't want to support it anymore. Instead, like, okay, do a new project and let yourself have a little bit more of that creative flow in that. So just I think that recognition that there's this sort of life cycle to software and companies and development organizations is important.
So if you weren't working on HTMX anymore,
yeah,
is there another area that you've been kind of like tinkering with in the back of your mind, or would love to spend more time with?
Yeah. Well, have you guys ever heard of Hypercard? I don't know if you're familiar with Hypercard.
I know about Hypercard because this is what the developers of the manhole and Mist used.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. Hypercard, it was a development environment. It was kind of like Smalltalk in that it was a total development environment. And when you were done, when you wanted to ship someone your code, you like froze the system and like, you didn't email it, but you gave like, I think it was called a deck, a Hypercard deck to them. Hypercard it's one of the things I learned when I was very young, and sort of first started. I programmed first in Apple Basic, but it was sort of right after that I started programming in Hypercard, and it was really, really neat in that like you drew a button and you double clicked on it, and then you wrote in this kind of Englishy language. And I think you guys saw in the book the Hyperscript. Probably threw up a little bit in your mouth when you saw it, that's normal. That's like the normal reaction to it. But it's a scripting language that is sort of Englishy in its syntax. And that's based on the scripting language from Hypercard, which was called HyperTalk, was the scripting language. So Hyperscript is based on HyperTalk, which comes from Hypercard. A lot of hyper in my life for whatever reason. I've always felt like web development. I like web development, but there's not this immediacy that I had back when I was doing Hypercard work, where in Visual Basic, people probably, as much as they even know what Visual Basic is, they like think it's this stupid and horrible programming language, and it had its problems. But it also had this characteristic where you drew a button on a screen and then you double click on the button and you write what you want to have happen when someone clicks on that button. And web development has had, there are systems that are like that, but they're not, they've always been kind of complicated under the covers. And so I've always felt like there's room maybe for something that allows people to put something beyond just a web page on the web in a way that captures sort of that magic of Hypercard that I experienced when I was a kid. So I think if I was just given unlimited money, I would probably work on something like that. That's probably what I'd work on.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the game The Manhole. This just goes back into history, but I played Myst a bunch, and my wife, we've been married like 20 years now, but we were like just reminiscing over childhood games, and she had played this, and I learned later that was not only made by the folks who made Myst, but it was done in Hypercard originally. Which is
that's pushing Hypercard pretty hard.
Yeah,
for sure. For sure. But it was a neat system. It was kind of a local hypermedia system. Like when I look back on it now with the learning with what I know now, it's like, oh, it's a local hypermedia system, like, because you could have links and things like that. It just wasn't on the network the way that the web is. So, but I think, there's something, programming's gotten pretty complicated. You can see that in like Hyperscript and Fixi maybe, or excuse me, in HTMX and in Fixi maybe even more so, where like and all of my tools, all the tools that I build for the web, I ensure that they work without a build step, because the build step, I think a lot of people who are in web development don't recognize what a barrier to entry a build step is, because they're like, oh, you just run this and then you run this and now it does all this stuff for you. I made this point, I think it was on a podcast. I think it was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago, where open source ideology, like the fact that, for example, grep is open source is meaningless to anyone who can't set up the tool chain necessary to compile and modify grep, right? Like it's open source. It's open source in theory only for people who don't have they're not these wizards that can set up these, complicated tool chains. And similarly, one of the great things about web development is that early on, there wasn't really a tool chain. You had to have a server or whatever, but usually someone else set that up. And you just put stuff in a directory and it just worked. And there was a level of accessibility to that really made the web like open in a way that, and JavaScript in particular, is just code just sitting there and it just worked. Like, this is crazy. I don't have to like install a compiler or anything like that. So with my tools, I really try and make it so all you have to do is load them with a script tag and they'll just work. Like we'll support like ESM modules and all that stuff as well as like something else that we do, but also they're going to be browser first. They're going to be built in this way so that you have this immediate accessibility. They have this immediate accessibility to them. And again, that's something I feel like is, for me as a developer, like my oldest son is starting to get interested in programming, and it's like, okay, start writing code. Well, do you have Python installed? And he's like, what does installed mean? And I'm like, okay, here we go. Like, okay, are you going to use a virtual environment? What's an environment? Like, okay, whatever. So I think one of the things I've been pushing for with my software is like peeling back that. Obviously you need to support that stuff, but also make it possible, like the minimum viable development experience, so that people can just write a file and start doing stuff, because it goes back to that immediate feedback that I got from Hypercard, and just like I just love that, make a change, hit F5 and it works. Cool.
Yeah, you don't realize just how much gunk is kind of wrapped up in modern software development. I've just been in this position where, for one reason or another, people who I consider, just as smart, if not smarter than me, have had to kind of start doing software engineering for their careers or something or other. And then I'm always surprised at the concepts they struggle with. It's just a reminder to me, because I'm like, oh, I struggle with that exact same thing. Like you said, like installing Python, right? Or like a virtual environment. And
Right.
it's all old hat at this point. But yeah, it's not it's more complicated than you think.
It is more complicated, and there's something like JavaScript has this magic thing that it's an interpreted programming language, so there's no tool chain. Like you can just write JavaScript in an HTML document and it works. And we do, don't do that. Put it in a JavaScript file. What's a JavaScript file? Like I feel like, and you can see that in Hyperscript too. Like Hyperscript is designed to be embedded in HTML. That's why the English syntax was picked. One of the reasons is because it embeds well in HTML, and so it doesn't look as foreign, right? If you write JavaScript, it's kind of this weird Java Lisp mashup that's like living there in your HTML document. It looks kind of strange, and so Hyperscript is more Englishy and it looks a little more natural in that environment. And so that's one reason why I picked that syntax for it. So if there are trade-offs associated with it, obviously, as like software grows, like there's a reason why we have code modules and all the rest of it, and so you have to be careful with that. But I do think like maybe we've gone a little too far away from things. And to get at your point about the psychological aspect of people, they get used to things. It's so crazy crazy how used to things we get. And I point this out to, like, I do a lot of Java programming, and I don't mind Java. I've got like, I can sit here and rant about Java for a very long time, but there's a lot of aspects I like about it. Like, I like, for example, Java style object-oriented programming. I wish that they had implicit interfaces like Go has, but when I write code in Go, I'm like, I just want to have an object. Like, just let me have an object with methods on it. Just stop doing this like weird C struct mashup thing. So in any event, I like Java in that regard. But one thing that Java has not had and forever is if you make changes to a class and you compile it, there's something called hot swap where it'll swap in the changes. But if you change a method signature, it breaks. And so
interesting.
you have to, like, if you change like the parameters that a method takes, it's like, I can't do that. And it pops us and you have to restart your system to see the changes. And it drives me absolutely bonkers for two reasons. First of all, it's been 25 years now, guys, and the hooks are there actually in the hot swap API to do it. They just haven't implemented it. And even worse, there is a guy who implemented it. His name's Thomas Worthing, and he presented in 2011. I remember I was at Sun. I was at Sun at their JVM language summit, and he presented like, hey, here's full hot swap. And I watched the Sun engineering team basically tell him what he was demoing was impossible. Like, they were like, no, it's not possible. And I'm like, dude, he's demoing. And that feature actually has like made its way into the Graal VM, which is this other project. It's like a JVM, it's like side project. And I think he works for Oracle, which Sun got bought by Oracle at this point. But like, when I point this out to people in the Java community, they're like, big deal, just restart it. And I'm like, man, you've obviously never programmed. Like, I programmed in Ruby on Rails for a long time, where you just make the change and you hit refresh and it works. And it's like, dude, this is so much better. Your life could be so much better if you would like be a little bit more open to the idea. Like, but a lot of Java people I talk to are like, it's fine, I'm used to it. So build tools, hot swap, like you see this pattern repeat a lot, and it's unfortunate. It's one reason why I think it's good to go back and look at these older technologies, because we're willing to put up with a lot of crap. There's a lot of old stuff that's really, really good. I point out like the Visual Basic debugger from back in the day was like unbelievable, like how good it was. If you like debuggers, I like debuggers. Like the VB6 debugger, my understanding is like it's the .NET VB.NET has like finally caught up with it like now.
Wow.
But it was like back in like the late 90s, that debugger was unbelievable. Like, just the functionality and what you could do dynamically at runtime was unbelievable with it. And Smalltalk similarly has like all these really cool ideas baked into it. Obviously I like Hypercard a whole bunch. So it's one reason I think it is good to go back and look at older technologies, because you'd be surprised at some of the things that we don't have anymore. Right, that are there, and I think a lot of those can be, can spark like, oh, well, we could do that today. That's like Hyperscript, and as much as you like it, is one of those sorts of situations.
Well, we can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast and chatting with us today. We always like to ask every author we have on before they leave if there are any books you'd like to recommend to our audience, again, fiction, nonfiction, CS or not.
Yeah. So Philosophy of Software Design, which I think you guys have covered,
We have, great book.
Is a good book. And I think like the papers, like No Silver Bullet is really good, holds up, talks about AI in it actually, which is interesting. It's from the 80s. The Worse is Better paper, I think, is really, really good and worth reading. And then as far as like nonfiction goes, I would recommend a book by an author named Mikhail Bulgakov. He's a Russian author. He wrote a book called The Master and Margarita. And it's a book, it's a really funky book. It's sort of parallel stories of the devil visiting Russia in like 1917, like right before or right after the revolution, with like this cast of characters. It's very surreal and like comic in sort of a dark comedy way. And then the story of the crucifixion told from the perspective of Pontius Pilate.
Interesting.
And it mixes those two end up coming together sort of in the end of the book.
Oh, wow.
And it's a really bizarre book. in many ways. But it was recommended to me by a Ukrainian guy that I worked with early on in my career, and I read it, and it's not super long. I think it's a couple, like 200-300 pages. It's not like a Dostoevsky or something like that, but it's an excellent book. And there's the one that I recommend is it has a shadowy cat on the cover. It's got a red cover with a shadowy cat on it, and that was the one that was recommended to me by that Ukrainian guy, as like, this is a book that you kind of have to read if you're, intellectually curious and you're a Russian speaker. And so it's a funky book. It's a really weird book, but I think it's a really powerful book too. So read the footnotes if you read it.
That's great. We always love, we get some authors recommending some out there stuff, and it's always fun to see, like that. Never in a million years would I have thought this book even existed, or that I should read it. So it's cool. Yeah. It's cool to hear this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Master and Margarita. It's a funky book, but man, it's a heck of a book. I read it every couple of years again, and the footnotes are awesome.
Well, very cool. Thank you again so much for coming on, Carson. Anything you want to plug before you leave?
Oh, shoot. HTMX.org is the HTMX website. Hypermedia.systems is the book. It's available online for free, so you don't have to buy it. I uploaded it to LibGen, so you can download it for free from there if you don't want to pay for it. What else? Unpoly, like the guy who created that is a really nice guy, and he's not as like wild on social media as I am, so he doesn't get as much attention sometimes. But I think if you're into the idea of hypermedia and progressive enhancement especially, but HTMX doesn't float your boat, then maybe take a look at Unpoly. Cool. They deserve more credit than they get.
Well, fantastic. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You can always find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io or the website bookoverflow.io. You can see our schedule of upcoming books. And you can find Nathan's work with his newsletter Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com. Carson, you want to plug your Twitter?
Oh yeah, it's twitter.com. Do it the right way. Go to twitter.com/HTMX_org. But I will warn your listeners that I am very silly, very silly. So
sounds good.
If that doesn't appeal to you, you may want to block me instead of follow me. So,
well, fantastic. Thanks again for coming on, Carson. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you reviewing the book and
not a problem.
Willing to talk to me. So.